The Seventh Guest, a novel by Matthew J. Costello and Craig Shaw Gardner. This is a Savvy Gaming Network production. Chapter 1. Nothing kept out the cold. Henry Stauf gathered the remains of his coat around his narrow shoulders. The wind shoved at him, trying to force him to shelter. Here he was freezing, in Nowhere Town, halfway between New York City and Lake Ontario. This cold, and it wasn't even winter yet. He seemed to shiver all the time now. He wished he hadn't thrown away the gun. He was so sure that they were going to get him for the stick-up after that bastard clerk had yanked away his mask. He had walked into a dusty little store just as the sun was setting, a handkerchief tied to cover all of his face below his eyes. Stauf always planned his robberies for that time of day. It was easier to lose yourself in a hick town like this after it got dark. The place looked like a grocery store, cans and boxes stacked neatly on either side of a long aisle. But Stauf knew the guy ran a speakeasy out of the back room, one of a half a dozen establishments in this town. A speakeasy meant easy money, or so Stauf thought. As fat as the grocery clerk was, and he must have weighed 300 pounds, he moved like greased lightning when he saw a man with a mask. The clerk was going for something under the counter, maybe even a gun of his own, but Stauf was even quicker, and on top of the clerk before he could make his move. Stauf demanded money, and booze besides. Sure, the clerk wouldn't dare argue with Stauf's gun, but Stauf pointed the gun away from the clerk for an instant as he scooped up the money, and the clerk, jowls quivering, two beady, fearful eyes set deep in his fleshy face, jumped forward and pulled away the mask. Stauf panicked. Then, running with a fistful of bills in his hand, forgetting about the 3 bottles of hooch he'd set on the counter, panicked and threw away the gun. He used that gun plenty of times before, pointed it at people, made them give him their money, their jewelry, just about any damn thing he wanted, really. He'd only fired it once, and that time kind of by accident. The time he had to wave the piece at the smart-ass attendant at the filling station. When the bullet went through the attendant's shoulder, it took the smile right off his face. At the store, he panicked because he wanted to use the gun again. When the clerk yanked down the handkerchief covering Stauf's face, Henry had a picture of what came next. He put the cold muzzle of his 44 up against the clerk's nose and squeezed the trigger just once, gentle as a kiss. Stauf wanted to watch the clerk's blood and bones spatter across his fat cheeks up to either side. He wanted to hear the clerk's scream cut short by a bullet in the brain. You kill somebody, they send you up for life. Stauf heard those words like there was a little voice in the back of his head. Killing was different from stealing. Stauf stole because it was easy. He stole because he needed the money. He stole because he'd never been caught. And if he was caught, the hick cops in those dumbass burgs would nail him for 1 or 2 jobs at most. Strictly short-time stuff. But he wasn't ready for murder. So he dumped the gun and ran, thinking next time he looked at some guy's smug face, he'd pull the trigger for sure. It wasn't the first time that he had heard the voices talking to him. They were never more than a whisper in his head, and sometimes they were little more than an incessant thought. Listening to those little voices had kept Stauf alive, at least until this cold fall night. Now he was stuck at the edge of some godforsaken little town 2 miles this side of nowhere. He wasn't any good unless he had a drink or two under his belt and could feel the warmth that liquor gave him in his gut and in his blood. And he couldn't remember the last time that he had a decent meal. He'd walked until he couldn't walk any further, then he'd fallen down and slept away the day. Somehow, Stauf managed to get back on his feet. He glanced up at the clear, cold night sky. The stars were so bright that he had to look away. He'd fallen asleep in a lot full of crabgrass and half-dead trees the locals called a park. What the hell was the name of this place, anyways? He couldn't remember. Right now, he couldn't think of much of anything except how the wind froze his insides and how a good gun would feel in his hand. Stauf couldn't stop anybody without a gun. He didn't have a gun. Maybe he'd had enough left in his fist to do a decent job if he snuck up on someone and if he could stop his hands from shaking. Stauf stuffed his hands in his coat pocket. His right knuckles hit something. He must have put something in his pocket before he'd fallen asleep. Stauf tried to get his shaking fingers to pull it out, thinking maybe it was a forgotten bottle or the last bites of a sandwich. He had stolen something from the groceries, but he couldn't remember if it had been hours or days ago. But the thing in his pocket was hard and cold under his fingers, more like wood than glass. He got his hand around it at last and pulled it free, holding it up in the light of the stars. It was a hammer. He remembered now. About noontime, he wandered by a house under construction. The builders were all eating lunch on the far side of the place. For a second, he thought about begging for food, but the cops didn't like that. They already taken Stauf down to the station once, giving him a good beating after he asked a woman for a dime. Nobody begged in their town. Stauf didn't think he'd survive another one of their beatings. But while the builders were all eating lunch out of sight, they had left their tools behind. Maybe Stauf couldn't beg, but he could steal. He saw the hammer then, a small one that fit nicely in his hand. The voices had told him to take it. The voices were sorry he'd thrown away his gun. They wanted him to have a weapon. It felt good to have something in his hands. Stauf heard a woman's voice outside his head this time. She was singing, "Bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves, we will come rejoicing." A woman walking through the park, probably coming back from choir practice from the church down the street. Thought she'd take a little stroll on such a fine, clear night. Stauf stepped away from the path back into the trees. He swung the hammer, gave him strength. The woman's voice was growing louder, coming back from the church. People often wore their nicest things when they went to church, especially the women, trotting out good jewelry for the faithful to see. Bringing in the sheaves. She'd passed right in front of him. He'd wait for the voices to tell him when. Bringing in the sheaves. She began all over again, singing the words more loudly now, as if the hymn would protect her against the night. Her voice was strong, as if she was used to singing, but her voice quavered a bit on the high notes, as if they were hard to reach in the cold night air. The hammer felt warm in Stauf's hand. It felt good to hold to something solid, solid like a gun. Stauf smiled at the thought. No hymn was going to protect anybody tonight. She stepped into sight, a short woman with long black coat, her purse clutched close by her side, her hard-soled shoes cracking against the concrete path, giving a rhythm to her song. We will come rejoicing now. The voices threw him forward out of the shadows of the tree. Hammer raised above his head, he rushed toward the woman. His tired legs somehow managed a ragged run. His ears were filled with the sound of his heart and his own breathing, making the woman's song seem very far away. She turned and stared at him, open eyes. He raised the hammer even higher, ready to strike her down. But the woman didn't look afraid. "Oh," she whispered, "you poor man." She pitied him. The way he'd shivered and could barely walk, his threadbare coat and pants. She felt sorry for him. She was looking down on him. She reached out a hand as if she wanted to give him something with those pudgy fingers. Give poor Stauf a little something, a crumb or two. He can't take care of himself. Give him a little something before you kick him around again. She looked like she was trying to smile. Everybody smiled down at Stauf. Stauf felt the rage well up inside of him. No one would look down at him ever again. All his rage was in his hammer. His arm was lightning, the hammer thunder. He hit her in the head. He could feel her skull crush. The hammer sank into something soft underneath. She grunted in pain. "Not enough," he shouted back. He had to punish her, punish all of them for looking down at him, laughing at him, beating him, throwing him away like yesterday's garbage. He raised the hammer above his head and hit her again and again. He didn't want her pity. He wanted to hear her scream. She fell on the path instead, fell there and lay there. He stood for a moment and watched her blood spread across the concrete, a dark pool that flowed out from where her head hit the expanding halo. Then he grabbed her purse and fled. Chapter 2. There was no kindness behind their smiles. Their words were polite and their expressions pleasant, but Edward Knox couldn't look them in the eyes. If he hadn't been able to tell by their large size, with their cheap ready-made suits doing nothing to hide their heavily muscled frames, The emptiness of their gazes gave them away. They were Whitey Chester's men. They were there to do a job, and nothing Edward Knox could say would change that. They had been waiting for him in his kitchen when he got home from work. With their size and impatient manner, they dominated the compact kitchen of Knox's small and tidy house. Small and tidy, just the right size for Knox and his wife, with a bright white kitchen just barely large enough for a sink and a stove and an icebox, and a little breakfast nook across the way. Somehow, these coarse men in their dark suits seemed too large to fit in such a cozy space. The back door was open. Knox imagined the lock had been forced. Somehow it didn't seem proper to examine the damage while the two men were here. At least his wife was nowhere around. He guessed he should thank the Lord for small favors. No matter what these two wanted to do, maybe he could at least protect his beloved Eleanor for a little while longer. The men had told Knox to sit. He thought it best not to argue. They then proceeded to quickly, politely, and perhaps a little too eagerly describe what was going to happen if he didn't pay. If he didn't pay, he couldn't even begin to find that kind of money. If only he could get these men to understand. He could hear the desperation in his own voice as he tried to reason with them. But how can I pay you if you break my hand? The slightly larger of the two men, who had said that his name was Bert, smiled at this objection. I'm glad you asked, Mr. Knox. He glanced at his co-worker, who hardly spoke at all. From the lack of introduction, apparently didn't have a name either. See, Bert continued, Mr. Chester wants you to understand the nature of our business. Breaking your hand might be unfortunate for all concerned. He paused. His nameless friend nodded sadly. But it may also be necessary. Bert continued. His friend nodded, became more vigorous. What kind of a loss here, as unfortunate as it may be, will send a real message to the other customers. You might not be able to pay, but others will. Yeah, his friend agreed. Knox didn't like the enthusiasm he heard in that single word. Bert slapped Knox's shoulder gently, like they were a couple of old pals. Hey, you'll find a way to pay. It was Bert's turn to nod at his nameless friend. If not, we'll break your other hand, and then both your legs. His friend's grin got bigger with every passing word. Knox half expected the big man to giggle. In comparison, Bert's smile was the very picture of restraint. And when we're done with you, we'll start with your wife. Oh no. They couldn't they could do what they wanted to Knox, but he couldn't allow anything to happen to Eleanor. He looked away from the two bruisers, afraid to show too much emotions. Mr. Knox, when you borrow money from Mr. Chester and don't pay in time, well, it can turn into a lifetime commitment, Bert sighed. If you gotta sell pencils on the street corner, you're gonna raise the money. His friend opened his mouth to agree. We're gonna be around for a long, long time. This all seemed a little unreal. Knox had always given his wife the finest things he could afford, and sometimes even things he couldn't quite afford. Perhaps lately, with his wife's delicate nature and the small illnesses that seemed to come on both of them as they grew older, he had spent a bit too much on his wife's happiness. Somehow, he had found himself thousands of dollars in debt. He had tried the ponies to solve his problems, but not a single horse had come in, and the money he'd borrowed from the company payroll will sure be missed any day. Knox hadn't even wanted to begin to think about what might happen if the discrepancy was discovered. There had been nothing left to float the little short-term loan. His fellows down at the speakeasy told him about Mr. Chester. His rates were a little high, but he didn't ask any questions. That suited Knox just fine. He would get the money back to the payroll account with a minimum of fuss. After all, his fortunes would be turning around any day. But his luck had gotten no better. The horses were just as slow, and he didn't dare touch the payroll again. Knox had heard these gentlemen could be a little insistent about repayment, but he'd never imagined it would be anything like this. The mostly silent partner reached out towards Knox. His fingers snapped, as if hungry for Knox's hand. Just a few hours, Knox heard himself say. Bert shook his head slowly. Mr. Knox, you're a nice old geezer, but we've spent too much time with you already. His voice took on a tired tone, as if said these words too many times before. We're getting behind with our other obligations. Other obligations? Knox wondered how many hands they had broken on an average day. We need a reason. The nameless friend added his own hand an inch away from closing around Knox's wrist. Or we do it now. Reason? Knox felt a panic well up inside of him. He couldn't think of the reason why he was here, or the reason why these men would break his hands. What was the reason for anything? He pulled his hand back, hugging them close to his suit jacket. He felt the envelope in his pocket. Oh, yes. He quickly pulled the invitation free. Here's where the money's coming from. In just a few more hours. He'd opened the envelope and offered Bert the registered letter that he'd received at his office earlier in the day. Maybe we can just break a finger, the nameless friend said hopefully. You can still do most anything with a broken finger. But Bert took the letter from Knox and opened it. He seemed to read it all in a single glance. Bert whistled. The richest man in town, huh? It was Knox's turn to nod, his head bobbing up and down so quickly it threatened to make him dizzy. Yes, old Mr. Stauf. He has nothing to do with his money now. At his toy shop is closed, and you can see he thinks highly of me. Bert scowled at that. The other men looked back to Bert, as if waiting for some sign that it was time to break things. I, I have more than just his ear, Knox added quickly. Mr. Stauf is very interested in my plans, very interested and very rich. Bert frowned, deepened, as if he'd hurt to make this kind of decision. Well, maybe Mr. Chester can give you a little more time after all. We'd hate to have unhappy customers, the other man added, but he kept staring at Knox's hand. Knox continued to nod. Maybe Stauf would float him alone. If not, he had heard the house was full of antiques. Maybe he could manage to borrow one or two of those too. He offered to show the two men the door. No thanks, Bert answered. We've already found it once. We'll be seeing you, Mr. Knox, his friend added, right after the party. With that, they were gone. Knox clutched the invitation and the short personal note that had accompanied it, as if it was the only thing in the world that might keep him whole and healthy, which it was. He was still at the kitchen table when his wife appeared half an hour later with a story about how she had received a message from her Uncle Phil to meet her at the drugstore downtown. Knox had always urged Eleanor to be nice to Uncle Phil. He was her one relative with money. Except her uncle had never sent any message. He hadn't been at the drugstore, and when Eleanor had called his house, the cook said that he was out of town. Knox guessed that the little deception had been a gift from Bert and his friend to get Eleanor out of the way. He was glad that they at least spared her that unpleasantness, but he couldn't let his wife see how upset he'd become. She depended on him so. He looked down at the invitation still cradled in his hand. Dear, he began, looking up at her with his best smile. Something happened today. Something I think that might be very rewarding. He handed her the invitation. She screamed when she touched the envelope, throwing it to the floor as if it burned her hand. Knox jumped from the chair and rushed to her side. Dear? He asked. She should have been pleased, perhaps overjoyed. He had never expected a reaction like this. Oh, Edward, I don't know. She stared down at the envelope, her arms folded before her chest as if she might ward off a chill. There's something about where this has been, who's touched the paper. He paused as if the resonance had taken her words away. Knox took him in his arms, and she started to cry. Eleanor was such a sensitive woman. This day, with the false errand, must have been very trying for her. She was having one of her spells, as she called them. They always made her very emotional. Knox could never quite understand them. He looked down at the white envelope, very bright against the dull brown linoleum of their kitchen floor. It was only a party. What could his wife have possibly felt just by touching an envelope? Edward Knox sighed. It had been a very trying day indeed. Chapter 3. Stauf half run, half stumbled across the park. He had no idea where to go, only that he had to get away. The ground sucked at the bottom of his shoes. The once dry earth had turned to mud, and he staggered to a halt and looked up to where his feet had taken him. He had ventured into the marshlands next to the lake that ran along the edge of town. The cold air felt like ice in his lungs. He still couldn't get enough of it. breathing in ragged gasps. Now that he'd stopped, he didn't think he'd ever get to his feet to move again. He looked down at his hands. One held the purse, the other the bloody hammer. He looked out at the lake again. Maybe the voices had brought him here. The water was stagnant in the corner of the lake, full of weeds and dead leaves. Nobody would think of looking for a hammer here. His body swayed as he swung the hammer, as if throwing the bloody tool away would be too much for his balance. He let the hammer go anyways. He staggered, but somehow managed to stay on his feet. The tool made a satisfying splash as it disappeared beneath the still water. Stauf opened the purse. There wasn't much inside: tissues, a comb, a small cosmetic mirror. They all followed the hammer into the lake. He pulled out the small change purse, the kind that held together with a metal clasp. He popped the clasp open and pulled out the contents: 6 neatly folded $1 bills. This was not at all what he was hoping for. The woman had been wearing a nice cloth coat. She had had her hair done, and her shoes looked new. This was barely enough for a night or two of drinking. He had killed somebody for this? He had killed somebody. Stauf took a deep breath. There was finally enough air in his lungs. He had killed somebody. And the night was still stone cold and quiet. No screams, no shouts, no sirens, no dogs. Nobody seemed to care where Stauf was or what he had done. Maybe the killing didn't make any difference. He had killed somebody, and it hadn't felt bad at all. The voices hadn't warned him away this time. Whether he had a gun or a hammer or nothing but his bare hands, maybe he was meant to kill. Maybe the voices had just wanted him to wait until he was ready. Maybe now they were telling him that he was beyond the law. Or maybe, Stauf thought, he just needed a drink. Stauf shoved the money in his coat pocket. The promise of a couple of stiff belts got his feet moving again. He turned to his left and followed the edge of the lake until he found a street. He turned left again, back towards town, hoping it wasn't too far to the nearest speakeasy. He put his hand in his pocket to feel the crisp $1 bills. He liked the feel of money. He wanted a lot more of it around him. Just resting his hand against those bills made him feel better. It had been easy, so quick, back there at the park, and it had felt so satisfying to crush her skull. Hey, a human voice, shouted almost in his ear. You! Stauf left back from the road, turning towards the noise with a speed that he didn't know that he had. He was so lost up in what he had done, he hadn't even heard the police car pull up next to him. The cop inside the wagon had his gun pointed straight at Stauf's head. You wouldn't be thinking about trying to run, would you? The cop said, with a wave of his revolver. Stauf shook his head, trying to catch his breath all over again. The cop's shout had almost stopped his heart. Gun still on Stauf, the cop climbed out of the car and opened the back door. The policeman waved Stauf inside. You are Henry Stauf, the cop said, a statement, not a question. A couple of the boys described you from the last time you were in the station. We'd like to know every stranger who passes through town. The cop smiled. We make sure they don't wear out their welcome. Stauf climbed in the car. His ribs were still sore from a few days ago when the cops had worked him over for public begging. He didn't want to think what they'd do to him for murder. The policeman slammed the door after him and climbed back behind the wheel. They drove in silence back to town. Stauf's head was silent, too. The voices had been coming to him for more often than ever lately, sometimes 2 to 3 times a day. Where were they when he really needed them? The streets were dark, deserted, as they sped back towards the police station. They passed row after row of well-kept houses, all with new paint and nicely mowed lawns, and hardly any even with a light in the window. Most of the people kept to themselves and went to bed early in a place like this, the perfect small town. Right now, Henry Stauf wished that he was any place other than here. The cop jerked the car to a halt in front of the station. Stauf was yanked from the back of the seat and hurried up the steps. He expected to be taken back to one of the cells like before, someplace quiet where no one could hear what was being done. Instead, he was dumped in the corner of a large office full of people, about half of them in uniform. The cop that brought him in yelled at him not to move, then turned his face to a beefy sergeant sitting at a large oak desk. I got him, the first cop said, with a self-satisfied nod. He chuckled as he waved at Stauf. The guy who robbed Sweeney's grocery. Stauf looked up at that. They had arrested him for the grocery store? That was nothing. He grabbed a loaf of bread and some beef jerky, then managed to stumble out before the grocer got his fat ass out from behind the counter. That happened days ago. Stauf had almost forgotten about it. The sergeant grimaced in Stauf's direction. From the look of his face, he didn't like what he smelled. Stauf looked away from the cops. He didn't want to show them how relieved he felt. We've seen this guy before, haven't we? The sergeant asked. Listen, and ready. We got something worse. There's been a murder. The hope that had started to flutter around Stauf's chest froze and died. He remembered how the cops had used their nightsticks on him before. They beat you until you'd admit to anything. Once they got him back to the quiet cell, they'd start with the grocery store and work their way up to murder. Greta Schultz, the sergeant went on, walking through the park on her way home from choir practice. Stauf found himself looking back at the cops as if his eyes could do nothing else. Mrs. Schultz? Henry asked, his voice rising in disbelief. From St. Luke's? In a small town like this, Stauf realized they knew everybody who went to choir practice. In a small town like this, they knew everything about everybody. She wouldn't hurt, Henry went on. The pride that had been his voice was replaced by cold fury. Who would do? He turned back to look at Stauf. Stauf couldn't look away, Henry knew. It would be easy to pin the murder on this guy, the sergeant agreed, except he isn't the only vagrant passing through town. When Townsend found the body, he also found a fella trying to steal Mrs. Schultz's coat. Hell, he killed her for a coat? Henry leaned on the sergeant's desk. It's just Schultz, huh? We got the guy? The sergeant nodded. When we question him, I want a piece. The sergeant showed his teeth at that. Everybody in the station's going to want to be back in the cell. Henry slammed his fist down on the desk and turned back to Stauf. Well, let's see if we can give this bread snatcher some accommodations before we get down to real business. The sergeant ordered Stauf to empty his pockets. The only thing that he had was the 6 folded dollar bills. Henry stared at the bills in amazement. This bum actually has money. Oh, Stauf said quickly, the words coming to his head as if someone else was speaking them. I managed to do some odd jobs. Henry laughed. Jobs? You? Stauf nodded, and letting the words pour out again, I can still manage to swing a hammer. The sergeant grunted at that. Maybe this money will pay for the things you stole. Judge will go easy on you. Somehow, Stauf found that he was smiling. We'll see how happy you are after you spend a couple days in jail, Henry said, as he yanked Stauf to his feet. Come on, let's get you out of here. I got important business to attend to. They gave him a cell at the far end of the hallway from the place that he'd been questioned before. As he fell asleep, he could hear the faint pounding and the occasional screams. He tried to get comfortable on the wooden slab that served as a bed. The business down the hall didn't have anything to do with him. He knew now that he was meant for greater things. That night, his dreams, the distant screams turned to voices, and the voices sang to him in his cell. Chapter 4. Brian Dutton woke at the edge of the bed, already sitting as if poised to run away. No matter how many times he had the dream, it never got any easier. He always woke up short of breath, heart pounding, as if he had just run a mile. The bedclothes were tangled and drenched with perspiration. How funny how he could sweat so much when the dream was so cold. The dream was with him still. He saw the face pressed up against the ice, his brother's face. And in the expression, that sad resignation of his mouth and eyes, Brian could see his brother Kevin's unmistakable knowledge that his life was over. Brian threw the bedclothes aside and got out of bed. He needed to walk around, maybe get a little drink of water, give the image of Kevin a chance to leave his mind, as if Kevin could ever leave him. Brian had never been a match for Kevin. His older brother had been a better ball player, a better student. Girls flocked to him. His neighbors laughed at his jokes. Dogs wanted to be his lifelong friends. He was his parents' favorite, too, 1 year older and one step better than his brother. It was the way of the world, and Brian had to accept it. At least he did until that terrible day out in the ice. It had started out pretty much as usual for the brothers. Brian had enough trouble simply staying up on his skates, but Kevin's skates acted like extensions of his legs. Once he got going, he could race with the wind. Brian was doing his best to remain standing, keeping close to the pond's edge, hoping for a snowdrift to cushion his next fall. Kevin was swooping towards the center of the pond, doing great circles and figure eights. Next thing, Brian swore his brother would be skating numbers that he hadn't even been invented. Maybe they shouldn't have been skating that day, even though it was still January and unseasonably warm for the second day in the row. One of those mid-winter thaws you get upstate, a teasing bit of spring before being plunged back into 2 more months of winter. But on a day like that, you had to go outside. You had to move. The snow was too deep and crusty for running, so the only way for the brothers to move was to skate. Kevin and Brian had risen early and gone out to the lake at the edge of town before most of their friends had even sat down to breakfast. They were the only people at the lake shore that morning. The sun rising above the hills turned the sky the color of blood. "Come on, Brian," Kevin called, already a couple of yards away. "I'm coming," Brian had yelled back, even though he didn't want to leave the relative security of the shore behind him. He wished he had the confidence to zoom across the ice. He wished just once that he could be better than his brother at something. And then Kevin screamed. Brian could hear the ice crack beneath his brother's skates. The thaw had thinned the ice. He could no longer support Kevin's weight. Kevin's cries for help's arms flailing as the ice opened and he sank. He grabbed for the nearest edge of solid ice, but it crumbled in his hands. Brian skated towards his brother as fast as he could, but it wasn't fast enough. And how could he hope to get close enough to do anything for his brother without the ice failing under him? It wouldn't do either of them any good if he fell in two. "Brian," Kevin called, "do something. I can't. It's so cold." But Brian stopped skating abruptly, a single thought filling his head. Kevin could never be better than Brian again, if Kevin were dead. Brian shook himself. He didn't have time for that kind of nonsense. He looked back to the shore. Maybe he could find a tree branch or something to reach out to his brother that way, pull him out of the water into the thicker ice and closer to shore. But Brian could no longer hear Kevin's cries. He turned back out towards the lake again, in time to watch his brother open hand sink below the surface. Then Brian skated out towards his brother, going faster than he ever thought possible. He called Kevin's name, but got no answer. He stopped. Half a dozen feet from the edge of the crack, there wedged between the two plates of ice, was his brother's brown parka. And, just below that, pressed against the piece of translucent ice, staring up from beneath the waves, was his brother's face. Kevin was dead. But Kevin was still with him. He kept coming back to haunt Brian's dreams. Maybe Brian had thought 100, perhaps 1,000 times if he hadn't stopped, he might have been able to save his brother. But at other moments, he knew that the instant he paused, not only to save his life, but gave his life a whole new direction. His parents could never forget what happened, and they didn't let Brian forget either. If only Kevin were still alive, they'd say. But now Brian got on the team, dated the girls, got the money to go to college. With the hope of the family gone, everyone had to pay some attention to Brian. Over time, Brian realized that his brother had taught him a valuable lesson. Sometimes in life, you had to be ruthless. You had to look out for number one. Sometimes he thought the others will never do better than me if they're dead. Not that he was a murderer, but in the business world, there was more than one way to kill your opponent. He had managed to start up a neat little manufacturing base, underselling the competition. Maybe his wares weren't quite as good as the other brands, but if he'd sold them cheap enough for long enough, the other brands would eventually die off. No matter what, Brian had learned to be a survivor. Kevin had been the favored one, but now that Kevin was gone, Brian was a lucky man. Or so he told himself, but his business success was too small and too slow. One small factory in one small town. Half of his big deals fell through, the others hardly made a difference. He worked and still barely managed to stay afloat. The only real success story in their town was Henry Stauf. Everyone had to have his toys. There seemed to be no end to the demand. And then one day, Stauf simply stopped making them. What, was the man crazy? If Stauf was tired of producing the products, he should let somebody else take over, someone like Brian Dutton. He could bring the same assembly line production to Stauf's toys that he had to his other products. The toys might not be as personalized, but Brian could open new factories to meet the demand. This is what he should be dreaming about, not his long dead brother. If only his brother would leave him alone. Sometimes Brian Dutton wondered if his brother was waiting for Brian to join him, that maybe it was time for Brian to die too. Except, even there, Kevin had died in a much more spectacular way than Brian ever could. Enough of his brother. Brian walked to the other room and looked down at the letter spread open on the dining room table. Stauf wouldn't send him an invitation without a reason. Brian was the survivor. Brian was the lucky one. Stauf was a wealthy man. Stauf needed to do something with all that money. Brian had taken over for Kevin once. Maybe now he could take over for Stauf.